Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something pretty wild, using a giant sun shield in space to fight climate change. Sounds like sci-fi, right?
Yeah, it does. But it's an idea that's getting more attention, especially, with rising CO2 levels and how urgent climate action is these days.
Right. And our source material for this deep dive is a 2025 research article. It's called Analysis of Solar Radiation Shielding in Space for Climate Mitigations of the Earth. And it's from the journal Energy Science and Engineering.
Yeah, and what's really striking? The study starts by pointing out that CO2 in the atmosphere has already gone way past pre-industrial levels. It's hit like 417.2 parts per million.
Wow, 417.2. Compared to 278 pre-industrial, just to give everyone a sense of how much it's increased. So how does this sun shield, this space sun shield, come into play?
Well, this is where we get into something called solar radiation modification, or SRM. Basically, it's about purposely reducing how much sunlight reaches the Earth. And a sun shield is one way to do that.
So imagine like a massive structure. We're talking the size of Texas, out in space,
Yeah.
between us and the sun. How do you even, picture something that big?
Right. Well, the researchers suggest putting it at a special spot called the Earth-Sun L1 Lagrange point. And what's cool about this point is that the pull from Earth's gravity and the sun's gravity, they kind of balance out there.
So it just stays put, like a parking spot in space for a giant sunshade?
Pretty much, yeah. The shield itself would be built to reflect some of the sunlight back into space. It'd be like a giant dimmer switch for the sun.
And the whole point is to counter all the warming from the extra CO2, right?
Exactly. But of course, building something this huge and putting it in space, well, that comes with challenges.
Yeah, it's not like we can just build it overnight. What are some of the big ones the study talks about?
Well, just the size of it is massive. Getting all the materials up there, building it in space, it'd be a huge engineering project. And then there's the cost. I mean, it would be astronomical.
Right.
Literally.
Okay, so let's say we could actually do all of that. How well would this shield even work against climate change?
Well, the models in the study show that even a small reduction in sunlight, they're talking like 0.5%, could really lower global temperatures. It's like turning down the Earth's thermostat, just enough to slow down the warming.
Huh, that's pretty amazing. But I gotta ask, if we're dimming the sun, even a bit, wouldn't there be some downsides?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we'd be messing with a force of nature. We have to think about what could go wrong. The study mentions possible effects on weather, how plants grow, even whole ecosystems.
Right, so it's a trade-off. On the one hand, there's this urgent need to deal with climate change, but on the other, we could be messing things up in ways we don't expect. It gets complicated.
Yeah, it does. For example, the study talks about how regional climates could change, maybe in unpredictable ways. Some areas might get more rain, others might get hotter. Who knows?
And wouldn't this also raise, ethical issues? It could create inequality where some parts of the world benefit from the shield more than others, right?
That's a very valid point. If we ever went down this road, we'd need global cooperation. And we have to think carefully about who wins and who loses.
It sounds like this space shield idea, it opens up a whole bunch of questions, not just about climate change, but about unintended consequences and even the ethics of geoengineering.
Right. And that's exactly why we need to be having these conversations now. Before we even think about building something like this, we have to understand the risks as well as the potential benefits.
Well, it seems like space-based shielding, even though it could be a game changer, it's really just one part of a much bigger picture when it comes to tackling climate change.
For sure. It's not like this one solution fixes everything. The study itself makes it clear that it's a possible tool, not the answer.
Okay, so what other SRM methods are people looking into?
Well, there are a few others, and each has its own pros and cons, things like ground albedo modification, marine cloud brightening, and even stratospheric aerosol injection. All of these are being studied as ways to influence the climate.
Stratospheric aerosol injection. That one sounds interesting. What is that exactly?
So basically, it's about putting reflective particles high up in the atmosphere. The idea is to copy what happens after a volcano erupts. How the ash reflects sunlight and cools the planet.
Wow. So we're talking about creating a mini volcanic winter on purpose to fight global warming.
Well, yeah, but in a controlled way, of course.
Of course. But even then, it seems like these SRM methods, even though they could be powerful, there's a lot we don't know about them.
Absolutely. That's why we need good research, and we have to think very carefully. Before we try any of these things, we need to understand what could happen.
Yeah, it sounds like we're just at the beginning of figuring out what's possible. and what's at stake.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. It forces us to think hard about our relationship with the planet and how far we're willing to go to protect it.
Well, that's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And it feels like we've only just started to unpack this whole space-based solar shielding thing.
You're right. There's definitely a lot more to explore.
Don't worry, deep divers. We're going to keep going with this amazing topic. We'll look closer at the research, the challenges, and just what it would mean to have this incredible technology. After a quick message from our sponsors, we'll be right back. Welcome back, deep divers. Before we took a break, we were talking about some of the other ways people are researching, to modify solar radiation. And one that really stuck with me was this stratospheric aerosol injection. It's a pretty bold idea.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a concept that people have a lot of different opinions on. Basically, it involves putting reflective particles way up high in the atmosphere. The goal is to sort of mimic the cooling effect you get after a volcano erupts.
Yeah, it's almost like we're talking about creating a mini volcanic winter, right? To fight global warming. But I imagine there must be a ton of risks with doing something like that.
Yeah.
A lot of things we just don't know yet.
Oh, absolutely. There are a lot of unknowns, and that's why research on this method is really focusing on understanding those risks. One big concern is what it could do to the ozone layer, which is super important for blocking harmful UV radiation from the sun.
Right, that makes sense. And then there are also the questions about how messing with the atmosphere like that would affect weather patterns, globally, how much rain different areas get, stuff like that. It just seems like whenever we try to, manipulate the Earth's climate on this huge scale, there's bound to be unintended consequences.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's a very complex system. And that's why it's so important that we're having these conversations, right? Weighing the potential benefits against the possible risks. Because it's not a decision to be made lightly. No way.
For sure. Well, let's get back to the space-based solar shield for a minute. Earlier we talked about some of the challenges of actually designing and building something that massive and getting it up into space. But are there any actual plans in motion, to try to make this happen?
Well, actually, the study does mention a specific proposal. It was put forth by the India Foundation Society, and they've got this whole plan for a Texas-sized shield, aiming to have it operational, get this, by 2033.
2033. Wow, that's really soon.
Yeah.
So what are the key parts of their plan? How do they deal with all the, the massive challenges we've been talking about?
Their plan is really comprehensive. It covers pretty much everything from what materials to use to how to put it together in space. They're suggesting using this lightweight, super reflective material. It would be launched in pieces and then assembled up in orbit. So instead of one giant piece, it's more like a bunch of smaller parts. And that actually helps with some of the problems of getting such a huge thing into space.
So it's like building a giant jigsaw puzzle in space.
Yeah, kind of. Haha. And they've even thought about how to keep adjusting the shield's position and, which way it's facing to make sure it's working as well as possible and to try to avoid any unintended effects.
That's incredible. But even with all that planning, it still seems like such a huge, huge project. It makes you wonder, are we really at a point where we can seriously consider, engineering the Earth's climate? On that scale, I mean.
It's a really profound question, right? It makes you think about philosophy, ethics, all of that. Because we'd be stepping in and messing with the system that we don't fully understand.
And that brings us back to something we talked about earlier. Even if we could put this shield up there, and it worked, it would be a temporary solution, right? It wouldn't actually fix the root problem of climate change.
That's true. It wouldn't get rid of the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere and, the ones we keep adding.
So it's more like buying us time to figure out how to switch to cleaner energy and adapt to the climate changes that are already happening.
That's a good way to put it. It could potentially slow down the rate of warming, give us more time to cut emissions, develop new energy sources, and come up with other ways to deal with climate change.
Okay, so let's say, just for fun, that we do have this shield up there. It's working, dimming the sun a little, and slowing down global warming. Then what? Do we just, leave it there forever?
That's a great question, and it's one that the study actually talks about. The researchers point out that over time, even with a shield in place, cutting CO2 might become less effective.
Oh, wow. So even with this huge technological fix, The clock is still ticking. We can't just rely on a sun shield and call it good.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember that this is not a replacement for changing how we do things, how we get our energy, how much we use. Space-based solar shielding, if we ever do it, should be seen as one tool to help us.
Right, so it's a bridge, something to buy us time while we transition to a future where we're using cleaner, more sustainable energy. Not a permanent solution.
Precisely. It's about giving us the chance to change our relationship with the planet, not just trying to control it.
That makes a lot of sense. I have to say, though, it's still hard to wrap my head around the scale of this thing. A structure the size of Texas, floating out in space. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is. It shows how creative humans can be and how far we'll go to try to fix the problems we've created. But it also shows how important it is to think carefully about what we're doing, even when we have good intentions, because the consequences could be huge.
Yeah, it's definitely a balancing act. We need to do something about climate change and fast.
Yeah.
But we also need to be careful because we could end up making things worse.
You're right. This is about making smart decisions, thinking about the risks and the benefits, and really talking openly and honestly about how to move forward.
Well, deep divers, we've covered a lot of ground today. The science behind this idea, the challenges, the ethical questions, it's a lot. But as we've seen, the story of space-based solar shielding is just beginning.
Yeah, there's still so much to learn and discover about how it could be designed, how it might work, and what it could mean in the long run.
So stay with us. When we come back, we'll delve even deeper into what space-based solar shielding could mean for the future of our planet and for us. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We've been talking about this crazy concept of space-based solar shielding. Putting huge structures in space, like the size of Texas, to fight climate change.
Right, and as big as that idea is, what's even bigger is what it could mean for the whole world.
Exactly. We've talked about the science, how you'd build it, the good and the bad. But what about the future? Like, what if we really did put a sun shield up there? What would change?
That's where things get really interesting, right? We start to imagine, what could happen, different scenarios.
Okay, so everyone, think like you're in a sci-fi movie. Imagine there's a sun shield up in space. What's different?
Well, first off, we might see global warming slow down. That would give us time to switch to cleaner energy and, deal with the climate changes that are already happening.
So like hitting the pause button, but not really fixing what's already broken.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. But even with a shield, we'd still have to work on the root cause, which is all the greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere.
Right, it's not a magic solution.
Yeah.
But let's say we did manage to cut emissions. Well, this shield is up there. What would the world be like?
Well, there are a lot of possibilities. Imagine a world with less crazy weather, fewer heat waves and droughts. Maybe even some ecosystems could start to recover.
Wow, that sounds pretty good. But I keep thinking about what could go wrong. We'd be playing around with this complex system, and we don't really get it. What if we cause even more problems?
That's a really important point. And the study does mention that, putting up a sun shield could change regional climates in unexpected ways. Yeah. It could mess with rainfall, how plants grow, all sorts of things.
And then there's the whole question of who's in control. Who gets to decide if we do this, and who benefits the most? It's a big responsibility.
For sure. This kind of technology would need everyone to work together. We'd have to be open about everything and think hard about what's right and wrong.
So we're talking about a future where we can actually change the climate of the entire planet. That's kind of exciting, but also scary. It feels like a turning point.
It is. Science is giving us these choices now, and they could totally change the world.
It's a lot to take in. But that's what the deep dive is all about, isn't it? Looking at these complicated topics, figuring out what's important, and what it all means for the future.
Exactly. The more we understand, the better choices we can make. Knowing about these new technologies and what they could do, it helps us have those important conversations about what we want the future to look like.
So we've reached the end of our deep dive into space-based solar shielding. But really, this is just the start.
Yeah, the conversation goes on. We'll keep learning as scientists do more research and as we all figure out how to deal with climate change.
And remember, this is something that affects all of us. The decisions we make now, together and on our own, will shape the world we live in.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and let's keep this conversation going.